Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video we're going to take some of the skills from my directional building video and knock them on their side or turn them upside down, literally. The principles are the same, but a few additional skills will give your village a unique look and add some finishing touches to your builds. If you haven't already seen that video, you may find it helpful before watching this one. I would appreciate the extra views, but you'll still get the basics from this video. Stick around for the tips, as there's a trick that may not be immediately obvious even after you master manipulating your builds. Let's get started with building sideways first. The technique is the same as directional building, but instead of using the standard dynamic platform, we're going to build custom ones because they're easier to turn on their side. We'll start by setting down my favorite palatial pillar, and then for no reason other than its half height and in the same menu, I'll select log pillar 01. I'll place that against the palatial pillar and nudge it out 2 spaces. Above that, I'll connect an 8x8 foundation block to the palatial pillar, just above the log pillar so it's not touching. Then I'll snap 2 more foundations on top so it forms a cube. Once they're in place, I'll move around the backside to give the palatial pillar a smack with a pickaxe and let the cube fall down. I find this setup is quick and the cube almost always drops onto its side. Now that we have our dynamic cube, I'm going to set a couple walls in an L shape to align the cube perfectly with the snap grid. For this example, I'll be building in the world direction, but if you want to build in a different direction, you can set that up first and set your backstop walls in your custom direction. The steps will be the same. I suggest using completely flat walls, as some of the knightly walls and castle walls have bricks that protrude out on one side, which will cause your cube not to be flush. It's not a problem depending on what you want to build, but it could cause you issues. I'll discuss more on this later when we get to the tips. Once the walls are in place, I'll push the cube into the corner, giving it a nice shove to make sure it's right up against both walls with no gap. I'll select a 16x4 foundation block, and as we did with the directional build, I'll snap off the cube and nudge over to one side. Remember that no part of this piece can touch any of the dynamic cube. I'll push the cube out of the way just in case I make a mistake or I need it again later. Now I'll set up the first foundation piece at the bottom of the cabin and snap it to my marker. Then I'll clean up the blocks I don't need. From here, the cabin build is straightforward, so I'll speed through it. A couple of things of note are that prefabs will not snap in any direction other than the world direction. I also find that when you build sideways or upside down, the nudge feature can get a bit confusing. Left is right, right is left, up is down. For you OG Fortnite builders or PC players, it's probably not an issue, but I end up turning my controller sideways all the time. That's it, our sideways build is complete. I don't expect that most players will be constructing full buildings on their side, but it is a useful skill for adding siding or other aesthetics to different parts of a build. I use this technique on my Lego henge to place the castle flooring on the walls and give it a more authentic look of stone rather than foundation blocks stacked vertically. Or you can add a checkerboard wall to your garage with a Durr Burger poster. Now let's have a look at building upside down. Since we already have a dynamic cube, I'll use that to start with. We just need to get it upside down. Sometimes if you push hard enough it'll flip over, but I find that sticking a 16x4 foundation on the top and then adding a couple smaller foundations until gravity causes it to tip over works well. Then a whack to level out the upside down cube, and as usual, a few smacks to clean up the workspace. We now have an upside down dynamic cube. Then it's the same as the sideways build. I place a couple walls in an L shape and I push the cube into the corner. If you watch the directional building video, then you know what comes next. I put a piece of flooring on top, duck down, and set a palatial pillar underneath. And then I nudge it out of the way from the dynamic cube. Then I'll select the ridge piece from the roof, and while making sure my crosshair is on the upside down pillar, I'll adjust it up and down until I get the desired depth and nudge it into position. Once I have the first piece set, it's a straightforward process, so I'll speed through the rest of the build. This time, really fast, as I'm sure you are as tired of watching me build cabins as I am of building them. Presto, through the magic of editing, you have an upside down building. Again, I don't expect most people to construct a full upside down building, but you can do some pretty cool things to spice up your builds. I use this a lot for the finishing touches on the bottoms of my cliff builds. Now, let's get to the tips. If you watched my previous video, I showed that if you try to snap a directional piece of flooring on top of another piece of flooring, it'll crumble apart. And that's true if they're in different directions. But if the two pieces are in the same direction, but mirrored from each other, they will snap together. Let's take a look at that. Just as we did in the sideways build, I'll set up a palatial pillar and a couple of log posts, one on each side. And then I'll set up 3 8x8 foundation blocks on each side to create 2 dynamic cubes. Then I'll knock out the palatial pillar, allowing both cubes to fall in opposite directions. Then, just like before, I'll create the L-shaped walls, pushing the 2 cubes into the corner one at a time so they're back to back with each other. I'll set one 16x8 foundation away from the dynamic block, and I'll snap another block to the mirrored dynamic cube. Raise it up and away from the dynamic cube until you see it's highlighted red because it has no supporting piece. If I continue to nudge it over until it's back to back with the mirrored foundation we just set, it will highlight green. But this time, when you snap it in place, the block doesn't crumble. Using this technique, you'll be able to stick your cabins to your cabins. Of course, it also works on upside down builds using the same principle and a pillar to adjust the height. This is how I built this balancing village beacon and added the walls on top of these upside down roofs to make a rampart to keep the mobs and skeletons out. There is something to be aware of when performing this trick. Since the blocks are no longer bound to the world snap, you can get slightly misaligned blocks that are partial stud off from each other. In most cases, this will not cause an issue, but it could leave a slight overlap of bricks that looks out of place. Also, if you don't get your dynamic blocks level and flush and build something long like a wall, it could end up with the two halves either diverging, which would cause a large gap the farther away they get, or they might come together and clash so that you can't snap pieces together. This is why I suggested using flat walls when you align your cubes. Now that I've become comfortable using these different techniques, I find that I end up using them in combination with each other most of the time. I very often have builds that merge a custom direction with upside down parts and stuck together sections. I find that directional building is more of an art, and at times it can be frustrating when the corners don't line up or the blocks overlap. But the more you practice these skills, the more comfortable you'll become and the more fun you'll have with your builds. I appreciate all the support and feedback from my previous video. A special thank you to the Craftopia team and their community that reached out to me. Be sure to check out their Discord and all of their great creators. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new from it. If you made it this far, a like and subscribe would be highly appreciated. As always, thanks a lot and have fun building.